The late afternoon train wheezed to a stop at Cold Hollow Station, its iron wheels grinding against frost-covered rails. Steam hissed into the December air, mixing with the snow that had been falling since dawn. Ella Lanina Morgan pressed her face against the window one last time, watching the small frontier town emerge from the white haze like a watercolor painting left in the rain. She'd memorized every word of Thomas Hartley's letters over the past 6 months. His penmanship had been careful, almost delicate, describing Cold Hollow as a place of opportunity, where a man could build something lasting. He'd written about the general store he managed, the small house with blue shutters on Maple Street, and how he needed a good woman to make it a proper home. He'd never asked for a photograph, and she'd been grateful for that kindness. Now, stepping onto the platform with her worn leather valise, Ella understood why. Thomas Hartley stood near the station house, shorter than she'd imagined, his eyes widening as they traveled up to meet hers. She recognized him from the small tintype he'd sent, the same narrow shoulders, the same carefully waxed mustache, but where his letters had spoken of plans and promises, his face now showed something else entirely: disappointment, perhaps even revulsion. "Miss Morgan," his voice cracked slightly on her name. "Mr. Hartley." Ella kept her spine straight despite the weight settling in her chest. She'd learned long ago that slouching only drew more attention to her height. At nearly 6 feet in her traveling boots, she towered over most men, and Thomas Hartley was no exception. Behind him, a small crowd had gathered. Frontier towns were starved for entertainment, and the arrival of a mail-order bride was apparently worthy of attention. Ella heard the whispers starting already, saw the barely concealed smirks. "You're—" Thomas swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "You're considerably taller than I expected." "I am as God made me, Mr. Hartley." He took a step back, as if her height might be contagious. "This won't— I can't—" His face flushed red beneath his hat. "What would people say? What would they think, seeing you walking beside me? You're taller than most of the men in town." The crowd's whispers grew louder. Someone laughed, a harsh, mocking sound that cut through the cold air like a blade. "I see." Ella's voice remained steady, though her hands trembled where they gripped the valise handle. "And the promises in your letters, the home you spoke of, that was before I knew you were—" He gestured vaguely at her height. "This arrangement won't work. I'm sorry you've come all this way, but I can't marry a woman who makes me look like a child standing next to her." "Where am I to go?" The question came out smaller than she intended. She had exactly $3.40 to her name, having spent everything on the train ticket from Ohio. Thomas was already backing away, shaking his head. "That's not my concern. There's a boarding house on 2nd Street, Mrs. Hollowell's place. Perhaps she'll take pity on you." He turned, then paused. "I'll have someone fetch your trunk from the baggage car." "There is no trunk, only this." Ella lifted her valise slightly. His eyes widened again, this time with a different kind of horror. A woman with no proper luggage was a woman with no prospects, no family of means. He'd been corresponding with a pauper as well as a giant. Without another word, Thomas Hartley fled, his short legs carrying him quickly away from the platform and the woman he'd promised to marry. The crowd parted for him, some patting his shoulder in sympathy, others chuckling at the spectacle. Ella stood alone on the platform as the snow continued to fall. The crowd began to disperse, though not without backward glances and whispered comments that carried on the wind. "Lord have mercy, she's as tall as a tree." "Poor Thomas, can you imagine? What kind of woman grows that tall? It ain't natural." "She'll never find a husband who'd want to look up at his wife." Each word found its mark, but Ella had heard them all before. In Ohio, in Pennsylvania before that, and in Virginia where she'd grown up. The youngest and tallest of 5 daughters. Her sisters had all found husbands easily small, delicate creatures who fit perfectly into the crook of a man's arm. But Ella had kept growing long past the age when a young woman should stop, her body betraying her at every turn. The platform emptied until only the station master remained, an elderly man with kind eyes who pretended to be busy with his ledger. "Miss," he finally called out, "train's not coming back through for 3 days. You can't stand out here in the snow." Ella forced her feet to move. Each step felt like admitting defeat, but what choice did she have? She made her way down the platform steps, her boots sinking into the fresh snow. Main Street stretched before her, lined with buildings that looked exactly as Thomas had described them in his letters: the Mercantile with its painted sign, the bank with its brass fixtures gleaming through the window, the hotel with its grand facade. She'd imagined walking down this street on Thomas's arm, finally belonging somewhere, finally being wanted despite her unfortunate height. Instead, she navigated the muddy thoroughfare alone, aware of every stare, every turned head, every child who pointed before being hushed by their mother. The boarding house on 2nd Street was easy to find, a narrow building squeezed between a saloon and a laundry. The sign read, "Hollowell's Boarding House, respectable lodgings for ladies." Ella climbed the steps and knocked. A woman answered, round-faced and stern, her gray hair pulled back in a severe bun. She looked Ella up and down with the efficiency of someone who'd sized up many desperate women. "You're the bride Thomas Hartley sent for." It wasn't a question. "I was." "Mrs." Hollowell's expression softened slightly. "Fool man, never did have much sense, and less courage." She stepped aside. "Come in out of the cold. We'll discuss terms." The parlor was small but clean, with antimacassars on every chair and a fire crackling in the grate. Ella sat carefully on the edge of a horsehair sofa, trying to take up as little space as possible. "I have $3.40, she said before Mrs. Hollowell could ask. "I can cook, clean, sew, whatever work you need done. Room and board is $5 a week," Mrs. Hollowell said, but her tone wasn't unkind. "However, I could use help with the washing and mending. My arthritis isn't what it used to be. Work for your keep, and we'll call it even until you can find something more permanent." Relief flooded through Ella. "Thank you, Mrs. Hollowell. I promise you won't regret." "Don't make promises. Girl, just work hard and keep your head up. This town loves its gossip, but they love clean clothes and mended shirts more. You'll do fine if you don't let them see you buckle." Mrs. Hollowell showed her to a small room on the 3rd floor, barely large enough for a bed and washstand, but it was clean and private. As Ella set down her valise, she caught sight of herself in the small mirror above the washstand. Her dark hair had come loose from its pins during the journey, and her gray traveling dress was wrinkled beyond redemption. But it was her eyes that held her attention, still blue, still defiant, despite everything. She'd come to Cold Hollow believing a man's promises, thinking this time would be different. Thomas Hartley was the 3rd man to court her through letters, and the 3rd to reject her upon meeting. The first had been more polite about it, claiming a sudden religious calling that required celibacy. The second had simply left her standing at a train station in Pittsburgh, never to be seen again. But she was still here, still standing. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Mrs. Hollowell stood in the hallway with an armload of men's shirts. "Might as well start earning your keep," she said, though not unkindly. "These need mending by tomorrow. The Mercantile pays 15 cents a shirt, and you can keep half. It's not much, but it's honest work." Ella took the shirts gratefully. As Mrs. Hollowell turned to go, she paused. "That Thomas Hartley is a fool," she said quietly. "Any man who can't see past the surface of things doesn't deserve what's underneath. You remember that." After she left, Ella lit the lamp and began examining the shirts. Most needed simple repairs: missing buttons, torn seams, frayed cuffs. Her mother had taught her to sew before she died, back when Ella still believed she might stop growing if she were very good and prayed very hard. Outside her window, Cold Hollow settled into evening. She could hear piano music from the saloon next door, the laughter of men with no worries about being too tall or too poor or too anything. Somewhere out there, Thomas Hartley was probably sitting in his house with blue shutters, relieved at his narrow escape from a wife who would have embarrassed him. Let him, Ella thought as she threaded her needle. She'd survived worse than a coward's rejection. She'd survive this too. The snow continued to fall, covering Cold Hollow in a blanket of white that made everything look clean and new. By the time Ella finished the first shirt, she'd stopped listening for footsteps that might be Thomas coming back to apologize, stopped hoping this had all been a terrible mistake. She was alone in a frontier town with winter closing in, $3 to her name, and no prospects beyond mending other people's clothes, but she was still here, still breathing, still refusing to shrink herself down to make others comfortable. And that, perhaps, was its own kind of victory. The mercantile's bell chimed as Ella pushed through the door, her arms full of mended shirts wrapped in brown paper. 3 days had passed since Thomas Hartley's rejection, and she'd already established a routine wake before dawn. Help Mrs. Hollowell with breakfast, mend until her fingers ached, deliver the finished work, collect new pieces. It wasn't the life she'd imagined, but it was survival. Mr. Peterson, the mercantile owner, barely looked up from his ledger. Just leave them on the counter. Miss Morgan, Sarah will check the work. Sarah, his daughter, gave Ella a sympathetic smile while counting out coins. The whole town knew her story by now. The too-tall bride abandoned at the station. Some, like Sarah, showed kindness. Others weren't so generous with their compassion. 20 shirts at 15 cents, Sarah said quietly. $3 even. Ella pocketed her $50 and gathered the new batch of mending. As she turned to leave, the bell chimed again. A man entered, bringing with him the scent of pine sawdust and winter air. He moved with the easy confidence of someone comfortable in his own skin, tall enough that he had to duck slightly under the doorframe. He was dressed simply worn leather coat over a dark wool shirt, canvas pants tucked into well-used boots. His hair was the color of dried wheat, longer than fashion dictated, tied back with a leather cord. But it was his presence that drew attention, solid and unshakable, like the mountains that surrounded Cold Hollow. Afternoon, Ash. Mr. Peterson's voice warmed considerably. Got that order of nails you wanted? Ash Wilder. Ella had heard the name whispered around town. He ran a logging operation in the forest north of Cold Hollow, supplying timber for the railroad expansion. A man who kept to himself. They said, peculiar. Never came to church socials or Saturday dances. Some claimed he'd been raised by wolves, though that was surely gossip's embellishment. Their paths crossed at the door. Ella, focused on balancing her bundle of shirts, didn't see him step aside until it was too late. They collided, not hard, but enough to send her carefully wrapped packages tumbling. "Pardon me," she said automatically, dropping to gather the scattered clothing. He knelt too, and for a moment they were at the same height, eye to eye. His eyes were gray-green, the color of sage in winter, and they didn't flinch away from hers, didn't travel up her height with that familiar expression of surprise or dismay. He simply looked at her, direct and unblinking, as if she were any other person he might meet on any other day. "My fault," he said. His voice was rough, like he didn't use it often. "Wasn't watching where I was going." They gathered the shirts in silence. When he handed her the last bundle, their fingers brushed briefly. His hands were calloused from work, but gentle with the fabric. Standing, Ella braced herself for the inevitable reaction. But Ash Wilder simply stood too, and she realized with a start that he was taller than she was. Not by much, perhaps 2 inches, but enough that she had to tilt her head slightly to meet his eyes. "You're the seamstress," he said, not a question. "I mend clothes, yes." He studied her for a moment, then reached into his coat and pulled out a rolled bundle of fabric. "Got some shirts that need work. Been meaning to bring them to town." Ella recognized the dodge. The shirts looked barely worn, certainly not in need of mending, but she wasn't in a position to refuse work, especially from someone who wasn't looking at her like she was a circus curiosity. "I charge 15 cents per shirt. Half goes to Mrs. Hollowell for my board." "Fair enough." He handed her the bundle. "No rush on these." Before she could respond, he touched the brim of his hat, a gesture of respect she hadn't received since arriving in Cold Hollow, and moved past her into the store. Ella stood on the mercantile porch for a long moment, holding his shirts along with the others. The December wind cut through her thin coat, but she barely felt it. A man had looked her in the eye, spoken to her like she was just another person, not a giant or a curiosity or an object of pity. It shouldn't have mattered so much, but it did. Back at the boarding house, she examined Ash Wilder's shirts more closely. Her instinct had been right. They were nearly new, with only the smallest repairs needed. One missing button, a tiny tear in a sleeve that could have been ignored indefinitely. Work that would take her an hour at most, but would pay the same as shirts that needed extensive mending. "Charity," she murmured to herself, then stopped. No, not charity. He'd been too matter-of-fact for that, too direct. Something else, then. But what? "Mrs. Hollowell knocked and entered without waiting for permission, as was her habit. "Saw you talking to Ash Wilder," she said, settling into the room's single chair with a grunt. "Don't see that often." "He brought shirts for mending." "Did he now, Mrs.?" Hollowell's eyes sharpened. "That's interesting. Man's been doing his own mending for the 5 years he's been here. Martha Claiborne threw her daughter at him last spring. Sweet little thing. Perfect height. Perfect manner. He was polite, but might as well have been made of stone for all the interest he showed." Ella concentrated on threading her needle. "Perhaps his mending skills have deteriorated." "Mrs. Hollowell snorted. "Perhaps, or perhaps he's got eyes that see different than most." She hauled herself up from the chair. "Dinner's at 6. We're having pot roast." Alone again. Ella worked on the other shirts first, saving Ash Wilder's for last. When she finally turned to them, she found a small paper tucked into one pocket. Her name was written on it in careful block letters. Inside, a brief message. "The logging camp needs a cook and someone to keep the bunkhouse clothes mended, room, board, and fair wages. If you're interested. I'll be at the freight office tomorrow at noon. A. Belmo." Ella read it 3 times before the words truly sank in. A job offer. Not charity or pity, but actual work with wages and a place to stay. Away from town. Yes, and certainly unconventional. A woman alone at a logging camp. But then, when had her life ever been conventional? She folded the note carefully and placed it in her own pocket. Tomorrow was Sunday. The freight office would be closed for regular business. Ensuring privacy. He'd thought of that. She realized. Thought of her dignity, her reputation, such as it was. That night, she lay awake thinking. The safe choice was to stay at Mrs. Hollowell's, building her mending business slowly, enduring the stares and whispers until the town grew bored with her story. The practical choice, the proper choice. But when had being proper gotten her anywhere? Sunday dawned clear and bitter cold. Ella dressed in her best dress, still gray, still plain, but pressed and clean, Mrs. Hollowell raised an eyebrow when she declined to accompany her to church. "I have business to attend to," Ella said simply. "On a Sunday, but Mrs. Hollowell didn't press. Mind yourself, girl. This town has a long memory for scandals." The streets were nearly empty. Everyone either at church or staying warm indoors. Ella's boots crunched through fresh snow as she made her way to the freight office near the railroad tracks. She was early, but Ash Wilder was already there, leaning against the building's wall, seemingly immune to the cold. He straightened when he saw her, but didn't move forward, letting her come to him. She realized, giving her the choice to turn back if she wanted. "Mr. Wilder," she said when she reached him. "Miss Morgan." He studied her face. "You got my note." "A logging camp is no place for a woman. I assume you know what people will say." "People say a lot of things." His expression didn't change. "Question is whether you care what they say." Ella thought of Thomas Hartley fleeing across the train platform, of the whispers that followed her down every street, of a lifetime of being too much and never enough. "What are the terms?" she asked. For the first time, something that might have been approval flickered in his eyes. $20 a month plus room and board. You'd cook for 12 men, keep the bunkhouse clean, mend what needs mending. The camp's an hour out of town by wagon. You'd come to town once a week for supplies. Oftener if you wanted. The men are rough but respectful. They know I'd send them packing if they weren't." "And where would I stay?" "There's a cabin separate from the bunkhouse. Small but sound. Has its own stove and a good door with a strong lock." He paused. "I built it myself. It's solid." $20 a month was more than she could make mending clothes, even working every waking hour, and a cabin of her own, away from pitying looks and cruel whispers. "When would I start?" "Tomorrow, if you're willing. I've got the wagon here for supplies. You could ride back with me today. Get settled in." It was moving too fast. Her practical mind warned. She barely knew this man, but then she thought of his eyes meeting hers directly, of the careful way he'd handled her dropped bundles, of a job offer written in block letters to preserve her dignity. "I'll need to collect my things and settle with Mrs. Hollowell." He nodded. "I'll wait." An hour later, Ella sat beside Ash Wilder on the wagon seat, her single valise and a borrowed trunk of supplies in the bed behind them. Mrs. Hollowell had been surprisingly understanding, even packing a basket of food for the journey. "You mind yourself," she'd said quietly at the door. "But don't be afraid to take a chance on something different. Lord knows the usual way hasn't done right by you." Now." As the wagon rolled out of Cold Hollow and into the forest, Ella stole glances at the man beside her. He handled the reins with the same quiet competence he seemed to bring to everything. He hadn't tried to help her up onto the high wagon seat, hadn't offered unnecessary assistance with her valise. He'd simply waited while she managed on her own, ready to help if asked, but not assuming she needed it. "Why?" she asked finally as the town disappeared behind them. He was quiet so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "Ever try to fit a tall pine into a space meant for a rose bush?" "Yes," she said softly. "Doesn't work." He guided the horses around a fallen log. "Some things need room to grow proper, need soil that suits them, not what others think they should grow in." They rode in comfortable silence after that, the forest closing around them like a blessing. Snow-laden branches created a tunnel of white and green, muffling the world beyond. Ella breathed deeply, tasting pine resin and freedom. She didn't know what awaited her at the logging camp, didn't know if this decision would prove wise or foolish. But for the first time since stepping off that train, she felt like she could stand straight without apology, could take up all the space she needed. And if Ash Wilder noticed her sitting taller beside him, he gave no sign. He simply drove on through the winter forest, a man who understood that some things grew best when given room to be exactly what they were. The logging camp emerged from the forest like something that had grown there naturally, rough-hewn buildings nestled among towering pines, smoke rising from multiple chimneys into the crystal winter air. Ella counted quickly a large bunkhouse, a cookhouse attached to it, several storage sheds, and, set apart from the rest, a small cabin with a covered porch. "That's yours," Ash said, nodding toward the cabin. "I'll show you the cookhouse after you're settled." The men were out working. She could hear axes ringing in the distance, which gave her time to compose herself before facing a dozen loggers who'd likely never had a woman in their camp, much less one who towered over most men. The cabin was better than she'd expected. One room, but well-built, with a proper wood floor instead of dirt, a small stove, a bed with a thick straw mattress, a table and chair, and shelves along one wall. The window had real glass and faced east for morning sun. Everything was clean, if sparse. "Water pumps just outside," Ash said from the doorway, not entering without invitation. "Privy's down the path, has a latch inside. Cookhouse has its own supplies. But there's a root cellar here for your personal stores." Ella set her valise on the bed, testing the mattress. Firm and clean. "You built this?" "2 summers ago? Figured we'd need a proper cook eventually." He paused. "The men have been suffering through my attempts. They'll be grateful for real food." She almost smiled at that. "What time do they expect breakfast?" 5 o'clock. Earlier when the days get longer. I'll introduce you at supper tonight. That's at 6, between meals. You're free to organize as you see fit. Mending work usually piles up by the door. The men know to leave it there, not bother you direct." He showed her the cookhouse next. It was larger than she'd expected, with a massive stove, plenty of work surfaces, and a long table that could seat 15. The pantry was well stocked with basics: flour, salt, lard, dried beans, preserved meats, canned goods. "Supply wagon comes every 2 weeks, Ash explained. "You make a list of what's needed. I'll see it's ordered. Within reason." "What's reasonable?" "Food that'll stick to a man's ribs and keep him working. These aren't fancy eaters, but they appreciate variety when they can get it." He gestured to a ledger on a shelf. "Keep track of meals and costs there. I like to know where the money goes." It was all so practical, so straightforward. No flowery promises, no grand gestures. Just work that needed doing and fair payment for doing it. Ella found herself relaxing for the first time since arriving in Cold Hollow. "I should start supper preparations," she said. "What do the men usually eat on Sundays?" "Whatever I can manage not to burn." That almost smile flickered across his face again. "There's a roast in the cold box that's meant for tonight. Potatoes in the root cellar." He left her to it, and Ella threw herself into the familiar rhythm of cooking. She'd learned at her mother's elbow, feeding a family of 7 on whatever they could afford. Cooking for 12 hungry loggers would be different in scale, but not in principle. By the time the men returned as darkness fell, she had roast beef with gravy, mashed potatoes, carrots glazed with butter and brown sugar, fresh biscuits, and dried apple pie waiting. The smell filled the cookhouse, drifting out into the cold evening air. They filed in slowly. These rough men who made their living cutting down giants. Some were young, barely out of their teens. Others showed gray in their beards and the careful way they moved after a day's labor. They removed their hats at the door. Someone had trained them well and took their seats with curious glances her way. Ash entered last, taking his place at the head of the table. "Men, this is Miss Morgan. She'll be cooking for us and handling the mending. You'll treat her with the same respect you'd show your mothers and sisters. Or you'll answer to me. Understood." A chorus of "Yes, sir," and "Yes, Mr." Wilder rumbled through the room. "Now say grace, Olson, before the food gets cold." Olson, a massive Swede with arms like tree trunks, offered a simple prayer of thanks. Then Ella began serving, moving efficiently around the table, keeping her eyes on her work. The men's initial wariness dissolved at the first bite. "Lord have mercy," someone whispered. "Real food." "Is that butter on these carrots?" another asked in wonder. "Ma'am," Olson said carefully. "This is the best meal we've had in 2 years, maybe ever." The tension in Ella's shoulders eased. They weren't looking at her height or wondering about her circumstances. They were just grateful for a hot meal that tasted like home. After supper, the men cleared their plates without being asked and filed out, several touching their hat brims in her direction. She caught murmurs of appreciation, discussions about whether she might make donuts sometime, speculation about Christmas dinner possibilities. Ash lingered, helping her carry plates to the washing area. "You've won them over," he said. "Fastest I've ever seen it happen." "It's just food." "No." He set down the stack of plates carefully. "It's caring whether they eat well or not. They know the difference. Ella plunged her hands into the hot washing water, needing something to do. The one called McCready. His shirt was torn at dinner. Others look like they haven't been properly mended in months. There's a pile in the corner there. The men are supposed to handle their own, but he shrugged. Bachelor mending only goes so far. I'll need thread. Good strong thread, not the cheap stuff. And buttons, shell if possible. They last longer than wood. Make a list. I'll get it from town. They worked in companionable silence. Him drying what she washed. It should have felt strange. This tacit partnership barely a day old. Instead, it felt like something clicking into place, finding its proper fit. Later, alone in her cabin, Ella unpacked her few belongings. Her mother's Bible went on the shelf, along with her small sewing kit and the 3 books she owned. Her other dress hung on a peg. In the lamplight, the sparse room felt almost cozy. A soft knock interrupted her organizing. She opened the door to find a small pile of shirts on her porch, with a note, "No rush, A.W." His own shirts that needed mending. She realized, not charity this time, but simply work that needed doing. She brought them inside, smiling at the careful lettering. Tomorrow she'd rise at 4 to start breakfast. Tomorrow she'd begin proving herself all over again. But tonight, she had a warm cabin, a full stomach, and work for her hands. Tonight, that was enough. The weeks fell into a pattern. Up before dawn to start breakfast, flapjacks and bacon, biscuits and gravy, oatmeal with molasses. The men filed in like clockwork, increasingly cheerful as her cooking improved their mornings. After breakfast, cleanup came bread baking, preparation for the noon meal, then mending in the afternoon before starting supper. The mending pile grew smaller as she worked through years of bachelor repairs. She taught McCready to sew on his own buttons, showed young Sam how to darn a sock properly. They were eager students, these rough men, grateful for any knowledge that might keep them warmer or more comfortable. Ash appeared at unexpected times, helping her haul water when the pump froze, splitting extra firewood without being asked, leaving small offerings on her porch, a better lamp, a warmer blanket, once, a small bag of peppermint candies with no note at all. She learned their rhythms, their preferences. Olson loved her chicken and dumplings. Sam, barely 18 and homesick, nearly cried when she made corn pudding like his mother's. McCready had a weakness for gingerbread that she indulged whenever supplies allowed. And Ash. He ate whatever she put before him with quiet appreciation, but she noticed he took seconds when she made pot roast with winter vegetables, noticed how his eyes warmed when she remembered he liked his coffee black with a touch of molasses. Town trips became less daunting. She still drew stares, still heard whispers, but they seemed to matter less when she knew she was returning to the forest, to men who called her Miss Ella with genuine respect, to work that had meaning beyond mere survival. One evening in late January, she found Ash sitting on her porch steps when she returned from the cookhouse. He rose when he saw her, hat in hand. "Everything all right?" she asked. "Fine." He seemed to struggle with words. This man who used them so sparingly just wanted to say, "The men are different, better. Having you here, it's—" He stopped, started again. "It's good, that's all." Before she could respond, he was gone. Long strides carrying him back to the bunkhouse, but he'd left something on the step. A small wooden box, smooth and carefully made. Inside, she found spools of the finest thread, real shell buttons, good steel needles, and a pair of sewing scissors better than any she'd owned. No note, but she recognized the craftsmanship. He'd made the box himself, probably in the evenings when she'd wondered what occupied his time. Ella sat on her bed, holding the box, feeling something shift inside her chest. Not love, not yet, but recognition, perhaps, of another soul who understood that some gifts were best given quietly, that kindness didn't always need words, that seeing someone clearly was its own form of respect. Outside, snow began to fall again, blanketing the camp in fresh white. Tomorrow would bring another round of meals, another pile of mending, another day of being exactly who she was without apology. But tonight, running her fingers over the smooth wood of Ash's gift, Ella felt something she hadn't experienced in years. She felt at home. The March market day arrived with unexpected warmth, melting snow into muddy rivers that ran down Cold Hollow's main street. Ella guided the supply wagon carefully, having finally convinced Ash she could handle the monthly trip alone. She needed fabric for new kitchen curtains, and the men had bashfully requested pie filling, requests better made without their stern-faced boss present. The market square bustled with farmers and merchants, wives haggling over early vegetables, children darting between the stalls. Ella had learned to navigate these crowds efficiently, her height actually an advantage when spotting the best vendors from a distance. She was examining bolts of cloth when she heard it, that particular tone of whispered gossip that always meant someone was discussing her. "That's her, the giant woman from the logging camp. Living alone with all those men, it isn't decent." Well, what did you expect? No proper man would have her. She has to make do with whatever attention she can get. Ella's hands stilled on the fabric. 3 months at the camp had given her a thicker skin, but the words still stung. She turned to leave the stall, only to find Mrs. Jacob Thornton, the banker's wife and Cold Hollow's self-appointed moral guardian, blocking her path. "Miss Morgan," the woman's voice carried across the market square. "How? Interesting to see you in town." Mrs. Thornton." Ella kept her voice level. "If you'll excuse me, I have purchases to make." "I imagine you do, Mrs." Thornton's smile was sharp as glass. "Tell me, how many men are you cooking for out there? A dozen, all of them young and impressionable, I suppose." The implication hung in the air like smoke. Around them, other shoppers had stopped pretending not to listen. "I cook for 12 hard-working men who deserve hot meals and clean clothes," Ella said quietly. "Nothing more." "Of course, Mrs." Thornton's eyes traveled up Ella's height with deliberate slowness. "Though one wonders what kind of woman chooses such unusual arrangements, especially a woman already so far outside normal proportions." The words were carefully chosen, just shy of direct insult, but weighted with meaning. Several women tittered behind their hands. A woman who needs honest work and found it. Ella tried to step around her, but Mrs. Thornton moved to block her again. "Honest, yes, though I heard Thomas Hartley had quite a different opinion when he saw what had answered his advertisement. The poor man was quite shaken. He said you'd misrepresented yourself entirely." Heat flooded Ella's face. "I never—" "Ladies!" A deep voice cut through the tension. Ash Wilder stood at the edge of the crowd that had gathered, his presence somehow making the gossiping women seem smaller. "Mrs. Thornton." He didn't raise his voice, didn't need to. Something in his stance, in the quiet way he positioned himself beside Ella, made the banker's wife take a small step back. "Mr. Wilder, I didn't realize you came to town for market day." "I don't usually." His gray-green eyes were steady on Mrs. Thornton's face. "But I needed to speak to Peterson about lumber orders. Lucky timing, it seems." "Mrs. Thornton's smile faltered. "We were just discussing Miss Morgan's situation." "Were you—" It wasn't a question. Ash's gaze traveled over the gathered crowd, and Ella watched people suddenly remember urgent business elsewhere. "Seems to me a woman's employment isn't a matter for public discussion. Unless you'd like to discuss your husband's gambling debts from last month's poker game, I heard that was quite the sum." Mrs. Thornton went pale. "I don't know what you mean." "No, my mistake then. Easy to get gossip confused in a small town." He touched the brim of his hat. "Good day, ma'am." He didn't touch Ella, didn't presume to take her arm or guide her away. He simply started walking toward the mercantile, trusting her to follow or not as she chose. She fell into step beside him, aware of the eyes following them, the whispers starting fresh. They walked in silence until they reached the wagon. Only then did he speak, his voice low enough that only she could hear.
"You all right?"
"Yes." The word came out steadier than she felt. "You didn't have to do that."
"Do what?"
He checked the wagon's supplies with apparent concentration. "I stated facts. Jacob Thornton lost $200 at cards last month. Had to take a loan from Judge Harper to cover it. If his wife wants to discuss other people's business, she should expect the same in return. She'll make things worse now, for both of us." He shrugged. "Let her try. I've been the subject of this town's gossip for 5 years. They say I was raised by wolves, that I killed a man in Kansas, that I practiced dark magic in the forest. Mrs. Thornton's imagination isn't that creative." Despite everything, Ella felt her lips twitch.
"Dark magic?"
Apparently, no one could build a successful lumber business without supernatural help. He finished his inspection and turned to face her. "You need anything else from town?" "Pie filling. The men requested it especially. Apple or cherry? Both, if Peterson has them." "I'll get it. You want to wait here or come with—" It was a simple question, but Ella heard what lay beneath it. Did she want to face the town again, knowing fresh gossip would follow? Or did she want to hide in the wagon, letting shame drive her into shadows? "I'll come," she said. Something flickered in his eyes. Approval, perhaps. "Good." They walked back through the market together, and this time the whispers had a different quality. Not just about the too-tall woman, but about Ash Wilder defending her, about what that might mean. Ella kept her head high, matching his unhurried pace. In Peterson's store, Sarah served them with extra warmth, pointedly ignoring her father's worried looks. She added an extra tin of cherries on the house and squeezed Ella's hand when counting out the change.
"Don't let them make you small,"
she whispered.
"Some of us think you're brave."
Outside, Ash loaded the supplies while Ella secured the fabric she'd managed to purchase despite the confrontation. As they prepared to leave, she noticed Thomas Hartley across the street, frozen in front of the barber shop. Their eyes met briefly before he scurried away, nearly tripping in his haste.
"Pathetic,"
Ash muttered, following her gaze.
"He's afraid,"
Ella said quietly,
"of anything that doesn't fit his narrow view of the world."
Fear's no excuse for cruelty. He helped her onto the wagon seat, necessary given the height and her skirts, not presumption. "Ready?" The ride back to camp was quiet at first. The forest welcomed them with its usual peace, snowmelt dripping from branches in a gentle rhythm. Finally, Ella broke the silence.
"Why did you really come to town today?"
He was quiet so long she thought he wouldn't answer.
"Sam mentioned you'd been nervous about coming alone. Said some of the women had been unkind on your last trip."
"You came to town just to—" She stopped, something warm unfurling in her chest. "Needed supplies anyway." His tone was carefully neutral. "Figured I'd get them today instead of next week." They both knew it was a kind lie. Ash Wilder planned everything with precision. He wouldn't change his supply schedule on a whim. He'd come because he thought she might need support, then stayed back until it was clear she did.
"Thank you,"
she said softly. He nodded, eyes on the muddy road. "You handled yourself well, better than I would have." "You handled Mrs. Thornton quite effectively." "I stated facts." A pause. "Though I may have enjoyed stating them more than was strictly necessary." It was the closest she'd heard him come to humor, and Ella found herself actually smiling. Her face, when you mentioned the gambling debts, was quite something. "Wait until she realizes I know about the debts from last Christmas, too. And the time her husband tried to court the Dixon widow while she was visiting her sister. You know all the town secrets. I know what people tell me when they're drunk at McCready's saloon, and what they tell Patrick when they're buying lumber on credit." He glanced at her. "Knowledge is protection in a place like Cold Hollow. They can't hurt you with whispers if you know which words will silence them." The camp came into view, smoke rising welcomingly from the cookhouse chimney. Home, Ella thought with a small start. When had she begun thinking of it that way? As he helped her down from the wagon, his hands lingered just a moment on her waist. Proper placement for assistance, but warmer than mere courtesy. For what it's worth, he said quietly, I think Thomas Hartley is the biggest fool in Colorado. Any man who runs from a woman with backbone doesn't deserve one. Before she could respond, he was unloading supplies, the moment passing like snow melt into the earth. But his words stayed with her through the afternoon's baking, through dinner service where the men exclaimed over fresh apple pie, through the evening mending by lamplight. She thought about Mrs. Thornton's cruel implications, about Thomas's cowardice, about a town that would always see her as odd and improper. Then she thought about Ash standing beside her in the market square, not touching but somehow sheltering nonetheless, about knowledge being protection, about backbone being something to value, not hide. That night, she found a small wrapped package on her porch. Inside was a length of deep blue ribbon. Impractical, beautiful, the kind of thing she'd admired at the market but would never buy for herself. The note simply said, For Sundays, the color suits you. A. He must have bought it while she was talking with Sarah. Must have noticed her lingering look at the ribbon seller's stall. Such a small thing, but it spoke volumes about attention, about seeing not just her height or her circumstances, but the woman who might want something pretty despite it all. Ella held the ribbon up to the lamplight, watching it shimmer. Tomorrow there would be breakfast to make, men to feed, clothes to mend. Tomorrow the town would still whisper, and Mrs. Thornton would still spread her poison. But tonight, she had apple pie cooling in the cookhouse, honest work that valued her contributions, and a blue ribbon from a man who stood beside her without trying to make her smaller. It was more than enough. It was abundance. The storm arrived without warning on a late March evening, transforming the world into a howling wall of white. Ella had just finished cleaning the cookhouse when the wind suddenly screamed through the trees, rattling windows and sending snow horizontal across the camp. Within minutes, visibility dropped to mere feet. She could barely make out the shape of her cabin through the swirling snow, though it stood only 20 yards away. The temperature plummeted so fast her breath crystallized before it left her lips. Miss Ella! Young Sam burst through the cookhouse door, covered in snow despite the short run from the bunkhouse. Mr. Wilder says to stay put. Says this is a bad one. Could last days. Where is he? Making sure all the men are accounted for. Olson and McCready were checking the equipment shed when it hit. Sam's face showed his worry. He'd only been with them 6 months, had never seen a late-season storm like this. Go back to the bunkhouse, Ella told him. I'll secure things here. Mr. Wilder said I should stay, help you get to your cabin. A massive gust shook the entire building, and something crashed outside. Sam went pale. We're not going anywhere in this, Ella said firmly. Help me bank the stove properly, then we'll settle in to wait. They worked quickly, securing shutters and checking supplies. The cookhouse was solid. Ash had built it to withstand worse than this, but as the storm intensified, even these thick walls seemed fragile against nature's fury. An hour passed, then 2. Sam paced nervously while Ella made coffee and checked their supplies. If they were truly snowed in for days, she'd need to ration carefully. A pounding at the door made them both jump. Ash entered in a whirlwind of snow, ice coating his beard and eyebrows. Behind him, supporting each other, came Olson and McCready. Thank God, Ash breathed when he saw her. When I couldn't see your cabin lamp. We stayed put, like you taught us, Sam said proudly. Ash nodded approval, but his eyes remained on Ella. Good. This is worse than anything we've seen in 3 years. Temperatures dropping fast. How are the others? All in the bunkhouse. These 2 were nearly lost when the shed door blew clean off. He helped Olson to a chair. The big Swede was shaking with cold despite his size. We'll have to crowd in here tonight. Bunkhouse stove can't keep up with this wind. Over the next hour, the men arrived in groups of 2 and 3, fighting through the storm from the bunkhouse. Soon the cookhouse was full of bodies, wet wool, and relief at being together. Ella kept coffee flowing and pulled out her emergency store's dried meat. Hardtack, preserves that could be eaten cold if the stove failed.
We've food for a week if needed,
she reported to Ash quietly.
Water might be an issue if the pump freezes.
I filled every bucket and pot I could find, he replied. You think ahead? Good. As night deepened, they arranged themselves as comfortably as possible. The younger men took the floor near the stove, while others claimed benches and chairs. Ash insisted Ella take the one padded chair, broking no argument. I'll be checking the stove through the night, he said. Might as well be comfortable while you can rest. But rest seemed impossible with the storm screaming like a living thing outside. The men tried to maintain good spirits. Olsen told stories of worse storms in Sweden. McCready shared increasingly unlikely tales of his youth in Kentucky. But tension grew as the wind found every tiny gap in the walls, sending icy fingers reaching for warm flesh. Near midnight, a tremendous crack echoed through the storm. The building shuddered.
Tree down, Ash said grimly. Big one, from the sound.
On the building, Sam's voice cracked slightly. No, we'd know if it hit us. But Ash moved to check the walls anyway, running his hands along the timbers, feeling for damage. Ella watched him work, noting the careful way he tested each beam, the quiet competence that kept the men calm. When he returned to the stove, she handed him fresh coffee.
You should rest, she said softly. The men need you strong tomorrow.
Can't rest when... He stopped, but she heard what he didn't say.
When you're in danger, when I can't protect everyone, when the storm might take what I've built. We're safe, she assured him. You built well, the walls will hold.
He looked at her then, really looked, and she saw the weight he carried, responsibility for every man here, for the business he'd built from nothing, for her. Always that careful distance, always that respectful protection, but underneath something deeper. I shouldn't have let you come to town alone today, he said suddenly. If you'd been caught on the road when this hit... But I wasn't, and you couldn't have predicted this storm.
I should have known, should have seen the signs.
She touched his arm lightly, feeling the tension in his muscles.
You can't control everything, Ash. Not even you can wrestle the weather into submission.
A ghost of a smile crossed his face. My mother used to say something similar. Said I'd try to organize the stars if I could reach them. It was the first time he'd mentioned family. Ella wanted to ask more, but a particularly vicious gust shook the building, reminding them of more immediate concerns. The night wore on. Some men dozed fitfully, but most remained awake, listening to the storm's fury. Ella moved among them, refilling cups, checking on those who'd been coldest when they arrived. Her presence seemed to calm them, perhaps because if Miss Ella wasn't panicking, things couldn't be too dire. Around 3 a.m, she found herself standing beside Ash at the window, trying to peer through the frost patterns at the storm outside.
I've never seen anything like this,
she admitted. Spring storms can be the worst, winter's last attempt to keep its hold. He stood close enough that she could feel his warmth, though he didn't touch her. Are you frightened?
No.
She examined the feeling to be sure.
I should be, perhaps, but I'm not.
Why? She considered the question.
Because you're here, because the men trust you, and I trust their judgment, because this building stands solid despite the wind.
She paused. Because I've faced worse storms than this, just of a different kind. He turned to look at her then, and in the dim lamplight she could see something shift in his expression. You're the strongest person I know, he said quietly. Man or woman? Before she could respond, young Sam cried out in his sleep, nightmare or cold. It didn't matter. Ella went to him, adjusting the blanket someone had thrown over him. murmuring soothing words until he settled. When she looked up, she found Ash watching her with an expression she couldn't quite name. He turned away quickly, busying himself with the stove, but the moment lingered in the air between them like smoke. Dawn came slowly, gray light barely penetrating the still raging storm. But with daylight came hope they could see the damage, assess what needed doing. The storm had peaked during the night. While still fierce, it no longer seemed world-ending. "We'll need to dig out," Ash announced once everyone was awake. "Check on the buildings, see what we've lost. But nobody goes out alone. Nobody goes far from rope lines." The men nodded, understanding the dangers. In storms like this, a man could be lost between buildings, frozen before anyone knew he was missing. "What about breakfast?" McCready asked hopefully, making everyone chuckle despite their exhaustion. "I'll manage something," Ella promised, "though it won't be my usual spread." She made pancakes on the stovetop, serving them with preserves and the last of the coffee. The men ate gratefully, energy returning with food and daylight. As they prepared to venture out, bundling into every layer they could find, Ash pulled her aside. "You'll stay here," he said. It wasn't a question. "The cabin can wait. I'll check on it when we've secured the essential buildings. Promise me you'll stay put." She saw the fear he wouldn't voice, that she'd try to reach her cabin alone, be lost in the white wilderness between buildings. "I promise." He nodded, then did something unexpected. He pulled off his own scarf, thick wool, warm from his body, and wrapped it around her neck. "Gets cold in here when the door keeps opening," he said gruffly, not meeting her eyes. Then he was gone, leading the first group out into the storm. The day passed in waves of activity. Men came and went, reporting damage, grabbing quick meals, warming themselves before heading back out. The storm gradually weakened, though snow continued to fall. Late in the afternoon, Ash returned with news of her cabin. Still standing, snows drifted up to the windows on one side, but the structure's sound lost some shingles is all. Relief flooded through her. That little cabin had become home in a way she hadn't expected. "Thank you for checking." "Course I checked." He seemed almost offended at her gratitude. "Soon as this clears, I'll fix those shingles myself." By evening, the storm had blown itself out, leaving behind a world transformed. Drifts reached halfway up buildings. Trees lay scattered like matchsticks. But the camp had survived. They'd lost one equipment shed and countless tools, but no lives. As the men celebrated their survival with the hot stew Ella had managed to prepare, she noticed Ash standing apart, staring out at the pristine snow. She joined him, still wearing his scarf. "We were lucky," she said. "Lucky had nothing to do with it. We were prepared. We stuck together. We had—" He stopped. "We had what?" He turned to her then, and for once his careful control seemed to slip. "We had you, keeping everyone fed, keeping spirits up. Do you know what it meant to them? Knowing you were here, calm as summer, making coffee like the world wasn't ending." "I just did what needed doing." "No." His voice was rough. "You did more than that. You made this place a home instead of just a camp. Gave us something worth protecting besides timber and profit." The weight of his words settled between them, around them. The men laughed and talked, but Ella felt caught in a bubble of silence with this man who built walls as carefully as he built cabins. "Ash." "I need to check the other buildings," he said abruptly, stepping back. "Make sure we didn't miss any damage." He was gone before she could respond, leaving her wearing his scarf and wondering if surviving the storm had broken something loose in both of them, something that might be harder to repair than shingles and shed walls. Spring arrived in full force after the storm, melting snow into rushing streams and filling the air with the scent of pine sap and new growth. The logging camp buzzed with renewed activity as the men worked to make up for time lost to the late blizzard. Ella had never been busier, feeding hungry workers who attacked the warming weather with enthusiasm. It was on a particularly fine April morning that trouble arrived in the form of Benjamin Prescott. Ella was hanging laundry when she heard the horses too many for a supply wagon, too organized for casual visitors. She watched from behind the sheets as 3 riders approached the camp's main clearing. The man in front sat his horse like he owned the ground beneath it, dressed in a city suit that looked absurd among the rough lumber buildings. She recognized him from town. Prescott, who'd made a fortune in railroad speculation and now had his eyes on timber rights throughout the territory. More importantly, she recognized the man riding beside him. Thomas Hartley. Her former intended sat uncomfortably in his saddle, trying to look anywhere but at the cookhouse. The 3rd rider was unknown to her, a broad-shouldered man with the look of hired muscle. Ash emerged from the mill building, wiping his hands on a rag. Several of the men followed. Sensing something significant in these visitors, Prescott dismounted with practiced ease, extending a hand that Ash didn't take. "Mr. Wilder, I'm Benjamin Prescott. I believe you know why I'm here. I know you've been buying up timber rights from anyone desperate enough to sell." Ash replied evenly. "The answer's still no." Prescott smiled, the expression never reaching his eyes. "Perhaps we could discuss this privately. I've brought a very generous offer." "Nothing to discuss. This land's not for sale." "Everything's for sale at the right price." Prescott's gaze traveled over the camp, calculating. "Though I must say, the operation is smaller than I expected, more primitive. I heard you'd modernized, but this looks barely better than a homestead camp." It was a calculated insult, and Ella saw Ash's jaw tighten. But before he could respond, Prescott's attention shifted to the laundry lines, and to her. Well, Thomas, isn't that your runaway bride?" Thomas's face flushed deep red. "She wasn't that is, the arrangement didn't work out. Yes, I heard." Prescott strolled closer, ignoring the way several loggers shifted positions protectively. "Miss Morgan, isn't it the woman too tall for polite society, now reduced to washing loggers' unmentionables? How the mighty have fallen." Ella forced herself to continue hanging a shirt, keeping her movements calm. "I'm not aware I was ever mighty. Mr. Prescott, just tall." He laughed, an unpleasant sound. "Clever, though not clever enough to hide what you really were advertising for in those marriage letters." A woman your age. Your proportions. Writing to strange men, we all know what that means." "That means a woman seeking honest marriage to build a life." Ash's voice cut through like an axe through soft wood. He'd moved closer without seeming to, now standing between Prescott and Ella. "Same as your own wife did when she answered your advertisement 5 years ago, before you had money, when you were just another speculator with big dreams and empty pockets." Prescott's face darkened. "How dare you?" "I dare because it's truth. Just like it's true you need my timber rights to complete your railroad deal. And it's true you brought Hartley here thinking it would somehow embarrass Miss Morgan into leaving, making me easier to manipulate." Ash smiled coldly. "You miscalculated." "Did I?" Prescott gestured broadly. "A woman living alone among all these men working as a common servant. The scandal alone." "What scandal?" Olson stepped forward, massive arms crossed. "Miss Ella cooks good food and mends our clothes, lives in her own cabin, proper as any church lady. You suggesting something else?" "I'm suggesting," Prescott said carefully, eyeing the growing circle of loggers, "that Mr. Wilder's judgment might be compromised by certain attractions, that perhaps he's not thinking clearly about business." Thomas finally found his voice. "It's unseemly. She refused to leave town after our arrangement ended. Now she's here, flaunting herself." "Flaunting?" Young Sam laughed incredulously. "Miss Ella wears more layers than a nun and works harder than any 2 men. Only thing she flaunts is her apple pie recipe, which you're not getting any of," McCready added, glaring at Thomas. Man who abandons a good woman at a train station doesn't deserve pie. Prescott raised his hands in mock surrender. Gentlemen, please, I'm simply trying to conduct business. Mr. Wilder, surely you see how complicated your situation has become? A logging camp with a woman in residence. Questions of propriety. The potential for scandal. He smiled thinly. Of course, if you were to sell to me, I'd ensure Miss Morgan had safe passage anywhere she wished to go. First-class train accommodations. Perhaps even a small settlement to help her start fresh somewhere far from here. You offering to buy me off? Ella stepped around Ash before he could stop her, facing Prescott directly. How much am I worth? Mr. Prescott, what's the going rate for removing an inconvenient woman these days? I'm offering you a chance at a respectable life. I have a respectable life. I work for my wages, live modestly, harm no one. If that threatens you somehow, perhaps you should examine why. Prescott's careful composure cracked. You're a disruption, an abnormality. Women like you upset the natural order. Women like me. Ella drew herself up to her full height, noting with satisfaction how Thomas stepped back. You mean women who refuse to disappear when men find us inconvenient, or just women who dare to be taller than you? All of the above, Prescott snarled. Wilder, I came here prepared to pay handsomely for your timber rights. But this circus changes things. I wonder what the good people of Cold Hollow would think if they knew exactly what kind of establishment you're running here. Ash moved so fast, Prescott barely had time to flinch. He didn't touch the man, but suddenly stood close enough that Prescott had to crane his neck to meet his eyes. You threatening Miss Morgan? I'm stating facts. You're making implications that'll get you hurt if you're not careful. Ash's voice was deadly quiet. Every man here would vouch for Miss Morgan's character. Would they do the same for you? How many foreclosures have you forced? How many families have you ruined for profit? That's business. So is this my business, my land, my employees. He stepped back. Get off my property. Don't come back. And if I hear one word of slander about Miss Morgan in town, I'll know where it came from. Prescott retreated to his horse, trying to salvage dignity. You're making a mistake. Wilder. I have influence you can't imagine. I can make things very difficult for you. You can try. Ash watched them mount up. But men who face down blizzards and 60-foot pines don't scare easy. Neither do women who've survived worse than your petty threats. As they prepared to leave, Thomas suddenly wheeled his horse around. Ella, Miss Morgan, You what? She met his eyes steadily. You're sorry you made a mistake. You've realized height doesn't matter when compared to character. She shook her head. Save it. Thomas, you showed me who you were at the train station. I'm grateful for it. Otherwise, I might have married a coward. His face crumpled, but he said nothing more. Spurring his horse to catch up with Prescott, the three riders disappeared down the trail, leaving dust and tension in their wake. The camp stood silent for a moment. Then McCready spat eloquently in the dirt. Good riddance to bad rubbish. Miss Ella makes better coffee than any 10 society ladies, Sam added loyally. And she doesn't shriek when she sees spiders, another man contributed. Remember when Mrs. Mayor visited last summer, thought the camp was under attack from all her screaming. The tension broke as the men began comparing Ella favorably to every proper woman they knew. She felt tears prick her eyes at their fierce loyalty. These rough men who'd adopted her as their own. Back to work, Ash ordered, though his voice was warm. Trees don't cut themselves. As the men dispersed, he lingered. You all right? Yes. She was surprised to find it was true. Seeing Thomas again, I thought it would hurt more. Instead, I just felt sorry for him. He'll spend his whole life afraid of anything that doesn't fit his narrow world. His loss. Ash picked up the laundry basket she'd dropped. Prescott won't give up easy. He'll make trouble if he can. Are you worried? About my business, no. About what he might try to do to you. Yes. He met her eyes. You could leave. I'd understand. Find somewhere he can't reach. Start fresh without this hanging over you. Ella looked around the camp, at her cabin with new shingles Ash had installed himself, at the cookhouse where she'd fed hungry men all winter, at the forest that had become her sanctuary. I'm not running anymore, she said firmly. Not from Thomas, not from Prescott, not from narrow-minded gossips. This is my home now. They'll have to do worse than threats to drive me off. Something flickered in Ash's eyes. Pride, perhaps, or something deeper. Then we'd better be ready for whatever they try next. That evening, as Ella served supper, she noticed the men were particularly boisterous, joking and laughing louder than usual. It took her a moment to realize they were putting on a show for her benefit, demonstrating that Prescott's visit hadn't dampened their spirits. Ash ate quietly, as was his custom, but when she refilled his coffee, he caught her hand briefly. You stood up to him well today, he said softly, low enough that only she could hear. But Ella, men like Prescott don't accept defeat easily. He'll look for ways to hurt you, to force my hand, if you need to leave. I'm not leaving. She met his eyes steadily. Not unless you want me to. His hand tightened on hers. That's the last thing I want. The moment stretched between them, full of unspoken possibilities. Then Olson called for more biscuits, breaking the spell, and Ella returned to her duties. But she felt Ash's eyes on her for the rest of the evening, protective and something more. Outside, spring continued its relentless advance, bringing new growth and fresh challenges. But inside the cookhouse, surrounded by loyal friends and under the watchful eye of a man who saw her truly, Ella felt ready for whatever storms might come. The evening was warm for late April, one of those soft spring nights when the air itself seemed to hold promise. Ella had finished cleaning the cookhouse and stood on the porch, watching fireflies dance between the trees. The men had retired early, exhausted from a hard day's work clearing a new section of forest. She heard Ash's footsteps before she saw him, that particular rhythm she'd learned to recognize over the months. He emerged from the shadows, carrying 2 cups of coffee. Thought you might want some, he offered, joining her on the porch. They stood in companionable silence, sipping coffee and watching the night. It had become something of a ritual these past weeks since Prescott's visit, this quiet time after the camp settled, when they could drop the careful distance maintained during daylight hours. Been thinking, Ash said finally. Dangerous habit. His lips twitched, the closest he usually came to a smile. About what Prescott said, about propriety and scandal. Ella's stomach tightened. Are you having second thoughts about my position here? No. The word came quick and firm. Never that. But I've been selfish, not thinking how this affects you, your reputation, your future prospects. What prospects? She turned to face him. Ash, before I came here, I was mending clothes for pennies, living on charity, being whispered about in town. Here, I have work I'm proud of. Wages that let me save money. Men who judge me by my cooking, not my height. What exactly am I risking? Marriage? A family? The things women are supposed to want. According to Thomas Hartley, who ran from me like I had the plague, the proper ladies of Cold Hollow, who crossed the street to avoid speaking to me. She set down her cup harder than intended. I'm 28 years old. Ash, I spent 10 years waiting to stop growing, then another 10 waiting for a man who could see past my height. I'm done waiting for things that won't come. What if they could come? The question hung between them like morning mist. Ella felt her heart skip, but forced her voice steady. What are you saying? He turned to her then, and in the dim light from the cookhouse windows, she could see the struggle in his face. I'm saying you deserve better than a logging camp and rough men who track mud through your clean floors. You deserve... Please don't tell me what I deserve. The words came out sharper than intended. My whole life, people have told me what I deserve, usually while explaining why they can't give it to me. I deserve a husband, but not them. I deserve respect, but not in public. I deserve happiness, but somewhere else. With someone else. Always someone else.
Ella,
I'm not finished. She drew herself up, using every inch of her height. You want to know what I think I deserve? I deserve to make my own choices, to work where I'm valued, to be seen as myself, not as a problem to be solved or a creature to be pitied. And if that means spending my life cooking for loggers and mending their clothes, then that's my choice to make. Ash was quiet for a long moment. Then, what if there was another choice? What do you mean? He set down his own cup and turned to face her fully. In the dim light, his eyes were more green than gray, intense with something she'd only glimpsed before. I mean, what if you weren't here as my employee? What if you were here as more? Ella's breath caught.
Ash,
Let me finish, please. He ran a hand through his hair, disturbing the leather tie. I've been trying to find the right words for weeks, months, maybe, but words aren't. I build things. Ella, I understand wood and stone and how to make them last. I don't understand how to tell you that you've changed everything. Changed what? This place, these men, me. He took a step closer. Do you know what this camp was like before you came? We survived, worked, ate, slept, worked again. Now Sam whistles while he works because he's thinking about your cornbread. Olson tells stories at dinner he'd never have shared before. McCready stopped drinking himself to sleep because he'd rather be clear-headed for your breakfast. That's just food and comfort. It's home. His voice roughened. You made this place a home. You made us a family instead of just men working for wages. And you made me. He stopped, struggling. Made you what? Made me remember why I built that cabin. Why I put in a window facing east and made the porch wide enough for 2 chairs. He met her eyes. I built it hoping. Didn't even know what I was hoping for until you walked into Peterson's store that day. Ella felt tears prick her eyes. Ash, I know I'm not what you dreamed of. Some educated man from back east who'd court you proper with flowers and pretty words. I'm just a logger who's better with trees than people. But I see you, Ella. Not your height or what others think is wrong with you. I see the woman who faces down blizzards and bullies with the same straight spine, who makes rough men gentle with kindness and good food, who stands tall not because she has to, but because she refuses to shrink. The tears spilled over now, but Ella didn't wipe them away. You never asked me to shrink, never looked at me like I was too much. You're not too much. You're exactly right. Perfect. He lifted a hand as if to touch her face, then let it fall. But I won't trap you here with promises you might regret. If you want to leave, find something better. There is nothing better. The words came from her heart, bypassing all careful thought. There's no place I'd rather be than here. No life I'd rather have than the one I've built in this camp. No man I'd rather... She stopped, suddenly shy. No man you'd rather what? His voice was soft, coaxing. She thought of all the letters she'd written to Thomas Hartley, trying to make herself sound smaller, more delicate, more acceptable. All the time she'd lowered her eyes and hunched her shoulders, trying to take up less space in the world. All the moments she'd apologized for simply being herself. I was promised to someone who couldn't bear to look at me, she said quietly, who saw my height as a flaw to be ashamed of, something that reflected badly on him, who made promises in letters he broke the moment he saw me. I'm not him. No, she met his eyes. You're not. You never promised me anything, never wrote pretty lies or made grand declarations. You just gave me work, respected my abilities, protected me without making me feel weak, built me a box for my sewing supplies because you noticed my hands getting pricked. You noticed that. I notice everything you do. The admission slipped out before she could stop it. I notice how you check the camp 3 times each night to make sure we're safe. How you give Sam the easier jobs when his homesickness gets bad. How you've been teaching McCready to read using the supply ledgers so he won't be embarrassed. And I notice you put extra sugar in my coffee when I've had a hard day. Make my favorite foods when you think I'm not paying attention. Mend my shirts first, with stitches so fine they're almost invisible. He did touch her face then, just the lightest brush of fingers against her cheek. We've been taking care of each other for months. Ella, dancing around what's growing between us. I didn't think you... I'm not the kind of woman men want. You're the only woman I want. The words were simple, direct, carrying the weight of truth. I don't need promises or guarantees. I just need to know if there's hope. If someday you might want more than employment here. If you could see yourself building a life with someone like me. Ella caught his hand, holding it against her cheek. His palm was calloused from years of work, warm and steady against her skin. I don't need someday. I already know. Know what? That I'm not here because I had nowhere else to go. I'm here because this is where I want to be. With these men who've become family. With work that matters. With you. His other hand came up to frame her face, and for a moment they stood frozen, balanced on the edge of something irreversible. Ella, I'm not afraid anymore, she whispered, echoing words she'd spoken months ago by a different fire. But this time she meant something deeper. Not afraid of judgment or whispers or being too tall. Not afraid of wanting someone for herself. He kissed her then, gentle and careful, as if she might break or disappear. She was neither fragile nor fleeting, and she kissed him back with all the certainty she'd found in these mountains. When they parted, his eyes were wide with wonder. "You're sure?" he asked. "I've been sure since you handed me my dropped laundry without a single comment about my height, since you offered me work based on my abilities, not pity, since you stood between me and Prescott like I was worth protecting." She smiled through tears that were purely joy. "I'm sure. Ash Wilder, the question is, are you..." Instead of answering with words he'd admitted weren't his strength, he kissed her again, this time with more confidence, more promise. Around them, the night sang with cricket song and wind in the pines, and Ella thought it sounded like a blessing. When they finally parted, both breathless, Ash rested his forehead against hers. They were nearly the same height this way, perfectly matched, and Ella marveled at how right it felt. "The men will be impossible when they find out," he murmured. "Sam's been hinting for weeks that I should court you proper. Olson's threatened to lock us in the supply shed if we don't figure things out soon." Ella laughed, surprising herself with the lightness of it. "They know. Everyone knows. We're apparently the only ones who thought we were being subtle." He pulled back to look at her. "This won't be easy. Prescott will use it against us. The town already gossips about you being here. If we're together..." "Then we're together," she finished firmly. "Let them talk. Let Prescott scheme. I've spent my whole life trying to make myself acceptable to people who were determined to find me wanting. I'm done with that. I choose this. I choose you." He studied her face in the lamplight, and she saw when he truly believed her, when the last walls he'd built around his heart finally came down. "Then we face whatever comes. Together." "Together," she agreed. They stood on the porch a while longer, hands linked, watching stars appear above the tree line. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Prescott's schemes, the town's gossip, the complexities of changing their relationship while maintaining the camp's daily rhythms. But tonight, Ella stood tall beside a man who saw her truly, in a place she'd made home, surrounded by chosen family. She'd traveled so far from that train platform where Thomas Hartley had abandoned her, not just in miles, but in understanding of her own worth. "I should go," she said eventually. "Dawn comes early, and hungry loggers wait for no one." "Ella," he caught her hand as she turned to go. "Thank you." "For what?" "For being brave enough to stay, for seeing more in this place, in me, than rough edges and sawdust, for being yourself." He lifted her hand to his lips. "For saying yes when I finally found courage to ask." She squeezed his fingers. "Thank you for asking,
for seeing me as more than a problem to solve, for giving me space to be exactly who I am.
As she walked back to her cabin, Ella felt as if she were floating. Behind her, she heard Ash's footsteps heading to the bunkhouse, probably to make his nightly rounds. Some things wouldn't change. His careful protection, her dedication to keeping the camp fed and comfortable. But everything had shifted too, like the earth settling after a storm. She'd found not just acceptance, but belonging. Not just work, but purpose. Not just shelter, but home. And in the eyes of a quiet man who built things to last, she'd found love that saw her truly, all 6 feet of her, and called her perfect. The cookhouse was warm with more than just the heat from the stove. May had brought wildflowers to the mountains, and Ella had placed jars of them on every surface. Purple lupines, white daisies, cheerful yellow buttercups. The men pretended not to notice how their rough dining space had been transformed. But she caught them smiling at the blooms when they thought no one was looking. It had been 2 weeks since that night on the porch, 2 weeks of careful renegotiation, of learning how to be themselves while being together. The men had taken the news with surprising matter-of-factness. Olson muttering about time, while Sam had actually applauded. But they'd also formed an unspoken protective circle around the couple, understanding that the world beyond their camp might not be so accepting. Ella was kneading dough for the evening rolls when she heard horses approaching, multiple riders, moving fast. Through the window, she saw Ash emerge from the mill, his expression darkening as he recognized the lead rider. Sheriff Coleman dismounted, his weathered face apologetic. Behind him rode 2 deputies and, inevitably, Benjamin Prescott. Ash, the sheriff nodded. "Miss Morgan." He touched his hat brim to her through the window. "Sorry to disturb your work, but I've got official business." Ash crossed his arms. "What kind of business?" "Mr. Prescott here's made some serious allegations. Says you're running an improper establishment. Claims Miss Morgan is..." Coleman cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Entertaining the men for money." The rolling pin cracked in Ella's hands. "That's a lie." Ash's voice was deadly quiet. "Course it is," Coleman agreed. "But when a man of Mr. Prescott's standing makes formal complaints, I'm obligated to investigate. Need to interview the men, inspect the premises." "You mean search for evidence of impropriety?" Prescott said smoothly. "I'm simply concerned about the moral welfare of these poor workers. Sheriff, a woman living among them with no supervision, no chaperone. I'll supervise you right into the ground if you say another word about Miss Morgan." McCready growled, appearing with several other loggers. They must have heard the horses and come to investigate. "Threats of violence," Prescott noted to the sheriff. "You see how she's corrupted them, turned honest workmen into men who won't stand for lies about a good woman." Olson interrupted. "Miss Ella works harder than any 3 people in Cold Hollow. Cooks, cleans, mends clothes. Nothing improper about it." Sheriff Coleman raised a hand for quiet. "I know Miss Morgan's character. Known Ash here for 5 years, and he wouldn't tolerate anything unseemly. But I've got to do my job." He looked genuinely regretful. "Need to speak to each man privately, check the living arrangements, make sure everything's as it should be." "Then do it," Ash said. "We've nothing to hide." The investigation took most of the afternoon. Coleman interviewed each logger separately while his deputies inspected the buildings. Prescott prowled the camp like a hungry wolf, looking for any detail he could twist to his purposes. Ella continued her work, refusing to let them see her hands shake. She rolled out dough with mechanical precision, shaped each roll perfectly, set them to rise. When Prescott peered through the cookhouse window, she met his gaze steadily until he looked away. Young Sam was the last to be interviewed. When he emerged from the sheriff's temporary office in the equipment shed, his face was red with indignation. "He tried to get me to say you were loose," he told Ella angrily. "Prescott, not the sheriff, kept asking if you ever came to the bunkhouse at night. if you gave special favors. I told him you make the best biscuits in Colorado, and that's the only favor we get."
"Despite everything," Ella smiled. "Thank you, Sam."
Finally. Coleman gathered everyone in the clearing. "Well, I've completed my investigation. Found exactly what I expected. A woman doing honest work for honest wages, living separately in her own cabin, treating these men like brothers or sons depending on their age." He turned to Prescott. No evidence of any impropriety whatsoever. "But the very arrangement," Prescott began, "is unusual but not illegal." Coleman cut him off. "Miss Morgan's free to work where she chooses. These men are free to employ who they choose, unless you've got actual evidence of wrongdoing, not just nasty suspicions. This matter's closed." Prescott's face darkened. "This isn't over. I'll take this to the territorial governor if necessary. No woman should be living in such circumstances. It's unnatural." "What's unnatural?" Ash said quietly. "Is a man so consumed with greed he'll destroy innocent people to get what he wants? How many families have you ruined? Prescott, how many homesteads have you stolen with legal tricks and forged documents? That's slander. That's fact, just like it's fact that you need my timber rights to complete your railroad deal. And it's fact that you're losing money every day I refuse to sell." Ash stepped closer. "But hear this clearly, I will never sell to you. Not if you offer 10 times the value. Not if you bring every lawman in the territory. Never. We'll see about that." Prescott mounted his horse with rigid dignity. "Sheriff, I trust you'll keep an eye on this situation, for the moral good of the community."
Coleman spat tobacco juice dangerously close to Prescott's horse's hooves. "I'll do my job, same as always, which means protecting honest folks from harassment."
After they left, the camp seemed to exhale collectively. The men dispersed slowly, muttering darkly about Prescott and city folks who didn't understand mountain ways. Ash found Ella in the cookhouse, finally allowing her hands to tremble as she shaped the last of the rolls. "You all right?"
"Yes."
She dusted flour from her hands.
"Angry, but all right. How dare he suggest... He's desperate."
Ash moved closer but didn't touch her. They'd agreed to maintain propriety during working hours. Railroad consortium's breathing down his neck. He promised them timber rights he doesn't have. Without my land, his whole deal collapses.
"So he tries to paint me as a..."
She couldn't say the word. "As a target. He knows he can't force me directly, so he attacks what I care about." Now he did touch her. Just a hand on her shoulder.
"I'm sorry. Ella, this is what I was afraid of. You being hurt because of me."
She covered his hand with hers.
"I'm not hurt. I'm furious. There's a difference."
She turned to face him. "And I'm not running, if that's what you're thinking." "I wasn't." "Yes, you were. I can see it in your eyes. That noble thought that maybe I'd be safer elsewhere." She poked him in the chest with a floury finger. "Ash Wilder. I survived being abandoned at a train station. Survived a winter blizzard. Survived months of gossip and speculation. I can certainly survive one greedy man's lies." "Despite everything," he smiled, "you're formidable when you're angry." "Good. Then you know better than to suggest I leave for my own good." "I wouldn't dare." He grew serious again. "But Ella, he won't stop. Men like Prescott, when they're cornered, they get vicious. He'll try other tactics." "Then we'll face them." "Together, like we promised." That evening, dinner was quieter than usual. The men ate heartily. Anger hadn't diminished their appetites, but there was an undercurrent of worry. They all knew Prescott's type, had all seen what powerful men could do to those who opposed them. "We could run him out of town," McCready suggested darkly. "Wouldn't be the first rich fool to disappear in these mountains." "No," Ash said firmly. "We do this legal and proper. Give him no real ammunition to use against us." "Miss Ella," Olson spoke up. "You need anything, you just say, any of us would swear in court to your good character." "All of us," Sam corrected. "Every man here."
Ella felt tears threaten. These rough loggers, some of whom had never had a kind word from a woman since leaving their mothers, were ready to stand up in court for her. "Thank you," she managed. "All of you." Later, as she walked to her cabin, Ash appeared from the shadows. It had become their ritual, this quiet moment between supper and sleep, when they could speak freely. "Coleman left something for you," he said, producing an envelope. "Said his wife wanted you to have it." Ella opened it curiously. Inside was a brief note in feminine handwriting. "Miss Morgan, we have not met, but I've heard of your situation. Please know that not all the women in Cold Hollow believe Mr. Prescott's lies. Some of us admire your courage. If you need voices to speak for you, you have them. Martha Coleman." "The sheriff's wife," Ella breathed. "I've never even met her." "You've served her husband coffee when he's passed through. He speaks well of you at home." Ash smiled slightly. "You have more allies than you know?" "Ella, people see your true character, even if they don't always speak up." She folded the note carefully. "It helps, knowing that, when Prescott was speaking, making those insinuations, I felt—" She searched for words. "Dirty. Like maybe I was doing something shameful just by being here." "You're not," his voice was fierce. "You're the best thing that's happened to this camp. To these men. To me." He paused. "Especially to me." They stood close, but not touching, aware that even in darkness, they might be watched. Prescott had probably left spies. "I should tell you something," Ella said quietly. "Earlier, when Prescott was here, when he kept pushing about impropriety, I wanted to tell him the truth. That you court me proper every evening. That we talk and nothing more. That you've been more respectful than any man I've known. Why didn't you?" "Because it's none of his business. Because what's between us is ours, not for public consumption." She met his eyes in the moonlight. "And because I knew he'd twist it, make it sound sordid somehow." "You were right." Ash's jaw tightened. "He'd use it as proof of his claims. Say I'd compromised you." "You can't compromise someone who chooses freely," Ella said firmly. "And I choose this every day." A night bird called from the forest, its song threading through the darkness. Around them, the camp settled into sleep, the bunkhouse windows going dark one by one, the mill wheels slowing as the stream quieted. "I've been thinking," Ash said eventually, "about the future, about protection." "What kind of protection?" He seemed to struggle with words again. This man who spoke with actions more than voice. "Legal protection, the kind that comes with documentation." Ella's heart skipped. "Ash, I'm not asking tonight," he said quickly. "Not like this. With Prescott's shadow over us, you deserve better than a proposal born from fear of gossip. But I want you to know I'm thinking of it, planning for it. When the time's right." "When will that be?" "When Prescott's dealt with. When you can say yes because you want to, not because you need protection from slander." He finally touched her face. "Just the lightest brush of fingers. When I can court you in daylight, not just stolen moments in shadow." "I don't need daylight to know my heart," she whispered. "I know, but you deserve it anyway. Deserve everything proper and right and celebrated." He stepped back, breaking the spell. "Good night, Ella." "Good night." She watched him walk away, making his rounds as always, checking locks and banking fires. Her protector, even when she hadn't asked for protection. Her equal, who saw strength where others saw oddity. In her cabin, she lit the lamp and pulled out paper to write a response to Martha Coleman. If the women of Cold Hollow were willing to speak for her, she'd give them reason to be proud. She'd continue her work, maintain her dignity, and wait for the day Ash felt free to speak his intentions in sunlight. But even as she wrote, she kept one hand on the window, ready to extinguish the lamp if trouble came calling. Prescott wouldn't give up easily, and men like him fought dirty when cornered. Still,
She'd meant what she told Ash. She'd survived abandonment and blizzards and gossip. She'd survived this too. And when the dust settled, when Prescott's schemes collapsed and the gossips found new targets, she'd still be here, still tall, still strong, still choosing the life she'd built with her own hands, still choosing the man who saw her height as strength, not shame. The lamp burned steady as she wrote, a small defiance against the darkness. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight she was exactly where she belonged, the warm kitchen wrapped around them like a blessing. Outside, June rain pattered softly on the roof, the kind of gentle shower that would coax wildflowers from the mountain meadows. Ella had sent the men to bed early after supper, claiming the need to reorganize her pantry. But organization was the furthest thing from her mind as she stood by the stove, watching Ash bank the fire for the night. 2 months had passed since Prescott's failed attempt to disgrace her. The railroad consortium had pulled out of his deal when the promised timber rights never materialized, leaving him near bankruptcy. His threats had faded to bitter silence, though everyone knew wounded pride could be dangerous. "You're quiet tonight," Ash observed, turning from the stove. "Thinking," she admitted, about how his hands moved with such careful precision, about the way lamplight caught the gold in his hair, about promises made in shadow that deserved to see the sun. "About time," she said finally. "How much of it we've spent dancing around truth." He went still. That particular stillness she'd learned meant he was listening with his whole being. "What truth is that?" "The truth that I came here a stranger and found home. That you gave me work but offered shelter for my soul, too." She moved closer, close enough to see the flecks of gold in his green-gray eyes. "The truth that I love you, Ash Wilder, and I'm tired of pretending otherwise." His breath caught. In all their careful courtship, through all their guarded conversations, neither had spoken the word aloud. "Ella, no." She pressed a finger to his lips. "Let me finish. You said once you were waiting for the right time, when Prescott couldn't hurt us, when you could court me properly in daylight. But Ash, we've had so little softness in our lives, so little that came easy. Why should love be different?" "Because you deserve—" "I deserve truth," she interrupted gently. "And the truth is, I don't want grand gestures or public declarations. I don't want you to court me like Thomas did, with letters full of promises that meant nothing. I want this. These quiet moments when it's just us and the rain and honesty between us." He caught her hand, held it against his chest where she could feel his heartbeat, rapid and strong. "You undo me," he said roughly. "Every wall I built, every defense I maintained, you walk right through them like they're morning mist." "Is that bad?" "No." The word came out fierce. "It's the best thing that ever happened to me. But Ella, I need you to be sure, not just tonight, with rain on the roof and lamplight making everything soft, but tomorrow, when the work is hard and the men are crude and town gossips whisper, next winter, when snow traps us again, years from now, when your hair goes gray and my hands get rough from more years of kneading bread." She smiled. "When the camp grows or fails, when times are lean or rich. Yes, Ash, I'm sure." He studied her face with that intensity that had first unsettled, then thrilled her. "I'm not an easy man, Ella. I know that. I get lost in my work, forget to speak for hours. I wake before dawn and work past dark. I'll track sawdust through your clean floors and come to bed smelling of pine pitch. And I'll feed hungry men 3 times a day, every day. I'll have flour in my hair more often than not. I'll mother grown loggers and fuss over their torn clothes." She stepped closer, eliminating the last careful distance between them. "We're neither of us easy. Ash, maybe that's why we fit." The kitchen was warm, private, a world unto itself. Outside, the rain intensified, drumming on the roof like celebration, or benediction. "I love you," he said, the words seeming to surprise him with their simple truth. I think I have since that first day. When you stood on that porch with dropped shirts and dignity intact, you were so strong, so determined not to let anything break you. I wasn't strong, I was terrified. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's moving forward despite it. His hands framed her face, thumbs tracing her cheekbones. You're the bravest person I know. Then be brave with me, she whispered. Stop waiting for perfect moments. Stop thinking you need to protect me from choices I've already made. Be with me, Ash. Really be with me. The space between them disappeared. His kiss was different this time, not careful or questioning, but certain. She responded with equal certainty, pouring months of longing into the connection. When they parted, both were breathless. Ella, he said, and her name was a prayer, a promise, a claim all at once. I know, she breathed. I know. They stood holding each other while rain sang against windows, and the stove ticked as it cooled. This was what she'd traveled so far to find. Not just a husband or a home, but this feeling of absolute rightness, of fitting perfectly into arms that had been waiting without knowing what they waited for. The men will be impossible when they realize. Ash murmured against her hair. They already know. Sam asked me yesterday when the wedding would be. He pulled back to look at her. What did you tell him? That he'd have to ask you. She smiled at his expression. What, you think you're the only one who's been waiting? I wanted to do this right. Give you choices, not obligations. Then choose with me. Her voice went serious. Choose to stop letting fear of what others think shape our days. Choose to build something together, openly, without apology. He was quiet for a long moment, and she could see him thinking, planning, that careful mind working through implications. Then he smiled, a real smile, transformative and young. All right, he said simply. We choose together. Together, she agreed. They talked quietly as the rain gentled, making plans. Simple ones. How to tell the men, though clearly announcement was barely needed. When to speak to Sheriff Coleman about making things official. Whether to have a ceremony here at the camp or brave town opinions. Here, Ella said firmly. With our family. Let town come to us if they want a witness. July, Ash suggested. When the meadow's in full bloom, we'll set tables outside, make a celebration of it. I'll cook for my own wedding, she laughed. That seems backward. We'll have the men help. Olson's been hiding a talent for pie making, and Sam's mother sent recipes. He smiled. They've been planning this longer than we have, as if summoned by their names. A suspicious amount of noise came from outside, coughing, shuffling feet, whispered arguments. Ash sighed. Gentlemen, he called without raising his voice. You might as well come in. The door burst open, revealing what appeared to be the entire camp crowded onto the cookhouse porch. Sam was in front, grinning broadly, while Olson tried to look dignified despite being caught eavesdropping. We weren't listening, McCready said unconvincingly. Just checking on that strange noise. What noise? Ella asked, fighting a smile. He looked desperately at the others for help. The sound of happiness, Sam supplied cheerfully. Very suspicious. Had to investigate. Get in here before you catch cold, Ash ordered, though his tone was fond. They filed in, dripping and shameless, filling the kitchen with masculine presence and poorly hidden grins. Ella automatically started making coffee. Some habits were too ingrained to break. So, Olson said with elaborate casualness, anything you'd like to tell us? Ash and Ella exchanged glances. She nodded slightly. We're getting married, Ash said simply. Next month, if that suits everyone's schedule. The cheer that went up probably woke wildlife for miles. Sam actually danced. McCready pounded Ash's back hard enough to stagger him, and Olson wiped suspiciously at his eyes. About damn time, someone called out.
We were about to lock you two in the supply shed. Language, Ella said automatically, then laughed as they all looked abashed. Oh, who am I fooling? This is wonderful. Miss Ella, Sam said earnestly. We already talked it over. We'll handle the food for the wedding. You're not cooking for your own celebration. And I've been working on something, Macready added shyly. A wedding gift. Been teaching myself fancy carving. My sister can come play fiddle, another man offered. She's been wanting to meet the woman who tamed Ash Wilder anyway. I haven't tamed anyone, Ella protested. No, Ash agreed, pulling her against his side in full view of everyone. We've tamed each other, or maybe gone wild together. Either way, we're choosing it. To choosing, Olson raised an imaginary glass, and the others echoed the toast with their coffee cups. They talked and planned until late, the kitchen warm with more than just stove heat. These men who'd become family, who'd protected and supported her, who'd seen her worth when others saw only oddity. They deserved to share this joy. Finally, Ash called a halt. Enough dawn comes early, and there's still a camp to run. To bed, all of you. They filed out with much backslapping and well-wishing, until only Ash and Ella remained. The rain had stopped, leaving the night clean and fresh. No regrets, he asked. Once this is known, there's no going back. You'll be the logger's wife who was too tall for proper society. I'll be Ella Wilder, she corrected. Wife to the man I choose, family to men who judge by character, not height, keeper of a home I helped build. She touched his face. No regrets, not one. He walked her to her cabin as always, but lingered at the door. 1 month, he said. Then no more separate cabins, no more careful distance, no more pretending we're not what we are to each other. What are we to each other? Everything, he said simply. You're everything. She kissed him then, there on her doorstep where anyone could see. Let them see, she thought fiercely. Let them know that the too tall woman and the antisocial logger had found in each other what the whole world couldn't give them separately. When they parted, she whispered against his lips, You can have my first night, Cowboy, my last night, every night in between, but only if you promise to give me yours in return. Already done, he breathed. Every night I have is yours, Ella Morgan, soon to be Wilder. From the first moment I saw you refuse to shrink. They've all been yours. The stars emerged as clouds parted, blessing their small corner of mountain wilderness. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, wedding plans mixed with daily work, the inevitable gossip when town learned of their engagement. But tonight, standing in her doorway with Ash's promise warming her heart, Ella felt taller than her impressive height had ever made her. She felt chosen, cherished, seen. She felt loved. And that, she thought as she watched him walk away with one last backward glance, that was worth every difficult mile that had brought her here. The morning sun transformed the meadow into a cathedral of light. Wildflowers swayed in the gentle breeze, purple columbines. Indian paintbrush red as flame. White mountain daisies that Ella had dreamed of since first seeing this place. Tables borrowed from every homestead within 10 miles stood ready, covered in checkered cloths and mason jars full of fresh blooms. July had come to the mountains in full glory, and with it, Ella's wedding day. She stood in her cabin, soon to be just a sewing room, wearing the dress she and the camp women had created together. Not white, for she was practical above all, but a soft blue that matched the ribbon Ash had given her months ago. The fabric had been Mrs. Coleman's contribution, the sheriff's wife arriving one day with determination and silk. No woman gets married in work clothes, she'd declared. Not on my watch. Now, as Sarah Peterson helped her with the final buttons, Ella marveled at the transformation. The dress had been cut to celebrate rather than hide her height, with a long, clean line that made her look like the mountain pines she'd come to love. Tall, straight, and proud. You're beautiful, Sarah said softly. Mr. Wilder won't know what hit him. Through the window, Ella could see the camp transformed. The men had worked for days, building an arbor of pine boughs, stringing lanterns for when evening came, creating something magical from rough timber and wildflowers. Half of Cold Hollow had made the journey up the mountain, curiosity overcoming gossip. "They've come to stare," Ella said. "Let them." Sarah's usually sweet face showed steel. "They'll see a woman who found her place, and a man who sees her worth. If that makes them uncomfortable, that's their failing, not yours." A knock interrupted. "Miss Ella," Sam's voice, excited and young. "Mr. Ash sent me to say he's ready when you are, and to give you this." Sarah opened the door enough to accept a small package. Inside, Ella found a note in Ash's careful handwriting. "For the woman who stands tall, forever. A." Below the note lay a necklace, not fancy jewels he couldn't afford, but a pendant carved from pine heartwood, polished until it gleamed. The design was simple, 2 trees grown so close their branches intertwined, inseparable. "Oh," Sarah breathed. "He made that, didn't he?" Ella could only nod, throat tight with emotion. She fastened it around her neck, where it lay warm against her heart. The walk to the meadow felt both endless and instant. The loggers lined the path, cleaned up and beaming, each offering a flower to add to her bouquet until she carried a riot of mountain blooms. Olson winked as she passed. McCready gave a courtly bow that would have looked ridiculous from anyone else. Then the crowd parted, and she saw Ash. He stood beneath the pine arch in his one good suit, hair tied back neatly, looking uncomfortable with formality but determined to do this properly. When he saw her, his expression shifted through surprise to wonder to something deeper than words. She'd worried, in the dark hours before dawn, that this was too much, that bringing their private world into public view would somehow diminish it. But as she walked toward him, as his eyes held hers with that steady certainty she'd come to trust, she knew the truth. Nothing could diminish what they'd built together. Judge Harper, who'd traveled from the county seat, cleared his throat. "Dearly beloved, we gather today to witness something I'd wager none of us expected. Ash Wilder taking a bride." Laughter rippled through the crowd, kind rather than mocking. "But then," Harper continued, "Miss Morgan isn't what any of us expected either, which makes this match either unlikely or inevitable, depending on your philosophy." Ash reached for her hand as she joined him beneath the arch. "Inevitable," he said clearly, for everyone to hear. The ceremony was simple. They'd written their own vows, neither trusting traditional words to capture their particular truth. "Ella," Ash began, his voice carrying across the meadow. "You arrived in winter, when everything seemed frozen and unlikely to change. You brought warmth I didn't know I was missing, turned a logging camp into a home, showed me that building walls wasn't the same as building a life." He paused, thumb brushing over her knuckles. "I promise to see you clearly, every day, to give you room to grow tall as the pines, to stand beside you against whatever storms come, to love you not despite your strength, but because of it." Ella's eyes blurred, but her voice came clear. "Ash, you gave me work when I needed purpose, respect when I'd forgotten its feel, love when I'd stopped believing it existed for women like me. You saw me not as too tall or too much, but as exactly enough." She squeezed his hand. "I promise to make your house a home, your camp a family, your life an adventure, to stand tall beside you, not behind you, to love you for the man you are, not the man others think you should be." "The rings," Harper prompted. Sam bounced forward with the wooden box McCready had carved, intricate pine branches and columbines decorating every surface. Inside lay 2 simple gold bands, purchased with the combined contributions of every logger in camp. "Our gift," Olson called out, "for the family you made us." Ella was crying now, not caring who saw. These rough men, pooling their wages for gold rings, this bitter judge, smiling with genuine warmth. This town that had whispered about her,
bearing witness to her joy. "Well then," Harper said when the rings were exchanged, "by the power vested in me by the Colorado Territory, I pronounce you husband and wife. Ash, kiss your bride before she changes her mind."
"Never,"
Ella whispered as Ash pulled her close. The kiss was brief. They were both too aware of their audience, but it sealed something permanent. When they turned to face the crowd as Mr. and Mrs. Wilder, the cheer that arose startled birds from the trees. The celebration that followed was unlike anything Cold Hollow had seen. Tables groaned under food the loggers had prepared with touching determination. Olson's pies were proclaimed better than any bakeries. Sam's mother's recipes, executed by enthusiastic if clumsy hands, filled the air with sense of home. Benjamin Prescott was notably absent, but Thomas Hartley had come. He approached during a quiet moment, hat literally in hand. "I owe you an apology," he said stiffly. "You owe me nothing," Ella replied. "You set me free to find what I actually needed." He looked between her and Ash, something like understanding crossing his face. "I was a fool, but maybe it worked out as it should." "It did," Ash said firmly. "For everyone." Thomas nodded and retreated, but not before leaving an envelope on the gift table. Later, they'd find it contained a deed to a small parcel of land adjoining the camp, his way of making amends. As afternoon melted into evening, the lanterns came alive, casting golden light over dancers and dreamers. The sheriff's wife taught Ella a mountain reel. Judge Harper revealed a surprising talent for fiddle. Even the townspeople who'd come to gossip found themselves swept into the celebration. "No regrets?" Ash asked as they took a moment away from the crowd, standing where forest met meadow.
"None."
Ella leaned into his strength.
"You?"
"Only that it took so long to get here." He pointed to where Sam was teaching McCready's niece to dance, where Olson was deep in conversation with the minister's wife about bread recipes, where their worlds had merged into something new. "Look what you built." "What we built," she corrected. As the evening star appeared, Sheriff Coleman called for attention. "Got something to say," he announced. "Been authorized by Judge Harper and the territorial government." He pulled out an official-looking document. "Mr. Benjamin Prescott's been arrested for fraud, forgery, and attempted land theft. Seems his railroad scheme included a lot of fake deeds and forged signatures. He won't be bothering anyone for a good long while." The cheer this time was even louder than at the ceremony. Justice served alongside wedding cake. What could be better? Later, much later, when the guests had gone and the loggers had stumbled happily to their bunks, Ash and Ella stood before the cabin that was now truly theirs. He'd added windows on every side during the past month, explaining gruffly that she deserved to see sunrise from any angle she chose. "Carry me over the threshold," she teased. "You're a strapping woman. Ella Wilder might throw out my back." She laughed, the sound carrying across the quiet camp. "Then we'll walk in together, as equals." "As everything," he agreed. They crossed the threshold hand in hand, into a home that smelled of pine and promise. The too tall woman who'd stepped off a train in winter, abandoned and alone, was gone. In her place stood Ella Wilder, wife, family maker, woman who'd learned that standing tall wasn't about defiance, but about refusing to be less than she was. The stars watched through new windows as two souls who'd thought themselves unmatchable discovered that sometimes the best things come to those who wait, who work, who choose love despite the odds. And in the morning, when Ella woke beside her husband to cook breakfast for hungry loggers, she knew she'd found more than a home or a husband or a place to belong. She'd found herself. Standing tall had brought her here, to this mountain camp where misfits made family, where a silent man spoke love in actions, where being exactly who she was turned out to be exactly right. No apologies, no shrinking, no regrets. Just love, tall as the pines and twice as strong. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I'd love to know where you're listening from. Please comment below and share your thoughts about Ella and Ash's journey. If you enjoyed this Wild West love story, please subscribe to my channel, Wild West Stories 1850. Give this video a like and hit the hype button to help more people discover these tales of courage, love, and standing tall against all odds.